So before the presentations, I just hope Elena can take us to a little tour through the website and also tell us when, not when, but perhaps where we will in fact find these new protocols for funding and so on.
Yeah, so I hope you can all see the screen. This is our website, the Society for the Study of Chinese Religions. And you might have been here before, but so the Society for the Study of Chinese Religions also works in tandem with the Journal of Chinese Religion. So that's where, if you want to join the Journal of Chinese Religions, this is where you do it if you haven't already joined. And also here we have sneak peeks. So we'll soon have another sneak peek for the May 2022 publication. So if you want to know what's coming up, you can have a look there. And also we have recent issues, etc. Also, we have a board of directors, a board and officers right here if you want to see who is on the board. But in terms of events, we have two regular events that we have decided to have every year, one at AAS, one at AAR. This is the AAS. We will put we will put the recording of today's today's event. Here we have the AAR, for example, we had an event at AAR, and this is the overview of that event. So we will put the poster here as well. I don't know that the poster is already there. I think, well, this was the call for papers. We will put the poster there as well as the recording. And here we have space for special announcement, for online events, for conference reports. In memoriam, we also we have Daniel Overmeyer and Christopher Schipper, sort of obituaries here. And here we have actually electronic resources, something that Tyler worked on. And so we have a few, if you want to find information or resources on Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, or other, probably also Christianity in China. And also, if all of you want to suggest things that we should put on this website, we are very open to suggestions to add to the website. We would really like to make this more of a place where people in the study that study Chinese religions go to find new information. And I don't know, Gil, actually, I don't think we decided where we will going to put the call for action for grants. So we will do that, soon, and then we will put this information. We will send out this information as widely as we can. But look for something on the website in terms of applying for small grants for possible workshops. Anything else you want to add, Gil?
No, I think that's fine. Yeah, we'll send out a notice, and then there'll just be sort of a set of protocols with the standard forms, and we'll decide on the entire structure of that. But if any of you are interested, also with the membership, but also as I said, the board, and we have regular elections. So just keep track of all of that. All right, I think we should probably start.
Yep.
Elena.
So we're going to start with Professor Kang Xiaofei introducing Peng Mu's book, Religion and Religious Practices in Rural China.
Okay, thanks everyone, and thank you and Elena. Should I introduce Peng Mu a little bit before I start about the book? Well, Peng Mu, Professor Peng is currently Associate Professor at the Institute of Folk Literature at Beijing Normal University. She has a BA from Fudan and an MA from Beijing University, and her PhD in folklore studies from University of Pennsylvania. So this book basically is based on her dissertation. The book is a substantial contribution to our understanding of Chinese religion in contemporary rural China. The book draws on her solid training in sinology and folklore studies from Beijing University and UPenn, and also on more than a decade's field work. She offered a rich and lively picture of religious practices in Chaling, a rural area in Hunan. Central to Peng's argument is that the constant interactions between yin and yang characterize Chinese conceptions of the world and their everyday experiences. Bodily practices, most saliently embodied by the very notion and action of bai, are the single most critical features for the Chinese to make effective connections between the yang and the yin world. Furthermore, the focus on bai, not as a mere ritual procedure, but rather as a continuously interactive social process, reveals, I quote, the elegant flexibility and vibrant dynamics of Chinese religious practice, end quote. In other words, bai makes beliefs meaningful in practices, and hence bai represents, in the Chinese word bai, represent the fundamental principle of Chinese religion. The focus of Peng's book is death ritual, but her book has successfully engaged with a wide range of theoretical issues central to the study of Chinese religion. First, the book echoes a number of leading scholars in the field to question the dichotomy of belief and practice typical in the post-Enlightenment Western definition of religion. Like Adam Chow's seminal work on rural Shanbei in roughly the same period, Peng's book calls attention to practices or doing religion. Peng's emphasis on bai and on bodily practices as a key to transmit and transform religious knowledge suggests a new paradigm shift to the study of Chinese religion and to define religion in Chinese terms. Second, the bai-centered approach challenges the conventional view on ritual as a unifying structure of practices. The book makes a compelling argument that ritual performances and everyday practices mutually informed each other and transformed each other. The line between orthodox and orthopraxy is fluid, shaped and reshaped by interactions between ritual specialists and the diverse needs of their local clientele. Finally, Peng's book sheds new light on the importance of material culture and the craftsmanship in Chinese religion. The book offers a great collection of images of richly decorated shrines, paper-made coffin covers, paper sedan chairs, and lavishly furnished paper houses, down to the minute details about where the telephone line is and where the TV set is staged. It's amazing. More than that, it links the production and the consumption of these paper products with the critical role of paper, what is called the yijiang shi, or the paper sculptors, and other ritual paper sculptors and other ritual specialists in rural culture. She does a superb job in contextualizing the trade of these specialists. The magical power of texts and rituals can only be realized through specific bodily practices that define the transmission of esoteric knowledge and the competition over business territories in between master and disciples of these ritual specialists. Another outstanding feature of the book is how the author seamlessly weave the personal and the scholarly into a stimulating account of economic detail, ethnographic details and insightful discussions. As a historian myself, who has had similar ethnographic experience in rural China, I found myself resonate very strongly with the other on so many occasions as she traversed many boundaries in and out of the community under study. She landed in Tallinn, this small town, as a scholar from the outside. But in the meantime, she's also a daughter-in-law in the local family. And gradually, she established herself as a community member through her marital family. And more pertinent to her study, a close friend and a nominal disciple of a local paper sculptor. So her native advantages afford her a family-centered instead of normally a temple-centered approach to local religious life, and also offered her rare access to the inner working of religious life from the native perspectives. In the meantime, as she acknowledges in the book, the fieldwork experiences or her participation in the various kinds of bodily practices and her final reluctance to buy, she has in the conclusion, she expressed why, the local people could buy, but she just couldn't buy in the local fashion because of her upbringing, different upbringing in an intellectual urban family. So her reluctance to buy in the local manner and the ethnographer's own rite of passage. She personally experienced transformation of body and mind beyond language, and yet with a scholarly lens and lucid writing style, she has successfully conveyed this personal transformation as an inherent part of what Chinese religion would do or can do. The only regret that I have with this book actually is that the book is based on her 2008 dissertation, and it was not published. I know must be some reason with scholars from China, going back to China, and maybe she did mention that she launched into other projects. So it was not published until recently, last year. So I wish that the book would have been published much earlier. It would be an immediate parallel to Adam Chow's book on the miraculous response on Northern China. It would be a wonderful pair, actually, in Shanbei. And her argument to refine Chinese religion to focus on practice and to focus on bodily practice would find much support in several key works on Chinese religion that came out in the early 2010s. So, in a way that I see clearly dialogues and great insights to reshape how we do research and how do we do ethnography, especially on Chinese religion. It would be desirable if the author could incorporate scholarship in the last few years into this monograph. Nevertheless, this is still a welcome addition to the study of Chinese religion. And the book set up a very high standard of doing ethnography in China. So congratulations, Professor Peng. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Within 10 minutes.
Perfect. Professor Peng, please.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can
Yep.
you?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning. Here is morning, very early morning. Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm really honored to be able to participate in this event. First, I want to thank all the board members in the SSCR, and especially Dr. Gill and Dr. Elena for their great efforts to organizing this event and to have my book selected and be discussed. And secondly, I want to thank Professor Kang Xiaofei for her careful reading in her spring break and very inspiring comments. Professor Kang is quite right that my book is a parallel to Adam Chow's book on Shanbei. I did get a lot of inspiration from his writing when I wrote the draft version of this current book. And we all want to redefine Chinese religion by invoking local ideas and highlighting the doing or practice of Chinese religion. Here, I want to emphasize 3 points. First, local terms are really illuminating and good to think with. Adam found Ling Ying or miraculous response, and for me, it's Bai. Can I share my screen? I have a picture which was.
I think you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, so. But there is a sign that only the.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Maybe I forgot. You're the only one. For some reason, I didn't get.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I want to show this one. Can you see this?
Yep.
Yeah, this is a very typical thing of Bai, which the picture is actually appeared in my book, but that's black and white. So this is a colorful one. Yeah, this is a thing that I think many of you are very familiar. It was a rite called Thanksgiving to Heaven and Earth. It is actually in Chinese 求天谢地, during a Taoist Jiao ritual housed in a village temple. Taoists set up a temporary outer table in the courtyard and ask villagers to line up. They are lining up, just all these villagers, they are waiting to do the Bai and to offer their incense. This is a kind of very big incense still used in rituals. And this man is a Taoist priest. And also these, I didn't have their images. And the 2 banners in the background were the flags, that is fan, that means to attract attention of the god in the other world. On the one hand, Bai refers to concrete bodily movements that express respect and awe, such as bowing, kneeling, or holding up ritual offerings. On the other hand, Chinese people also use Bai to characterize their religious inclinations and dispositions. Crystal-tiling religious dispositions and belief in a bodily action, Bai points to the core of Chinese religious life, that is the embodiment of beliefs as practices, as bodily actions learned and performed from early age within a family. As our current discourse and framework of religious studies cannot really go beyond analytical categories such as ritual, belief, church, and so on, we need to pay special attention to local, ethnic concepts and expressions instead of attempting to make diverse religious practice to fit into the narrow framework of analytical categories. I suggest to focus on the tension and discord revealed from comparing and juxtaposing analytical categories with local concepts. From the tension and discord, we can greatly enrich and broaden our understanding of religious practice in China. Professor Kang paraphrased Bai as a continuously interactive social process, and I think it also suggests further potentials for me to explore in future research. The second point is the fundamental cultural context of Chinese worldview of the yin and yang world. These 2 worlds communicate with each other constantly, different yet similar. Chinese religious practice are inherent part of and rooted from this yin-yang worldview, which represents Chinese people's way of dwelling, conceptualizing, and interacting with the universe, human and natural world, as well as other beings. I think this is the starting point for understanding Chinese religious practice. And finally, I suggest that we draw attention to family in Chinese religious practice, where everyone internalizes and embodies the yin-yang worldview and masters the practice of Bai through their upbringing in family life, especially the rites of passage and yearly celebrations. So my book focuses on the intimate formative process within household and argues that family, not temple, is the incubator of Chinese popular religious practice, which is actually embodied repertoire cultivated as a way of life in a world where the yin and the yang regularly connected and communicate. That's my response, and thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. Our next presenter is Suzanne Patrick, who will introduce and respond to Gail King's recent book, A Model for All Christian Women, Candida Xu, a Chinese Christian woman of the 17th century. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Elena. Thank you, everyone. I'll be responding to Dr. Gail King's book. So here is her book. I'll give a short biography of Dr. Gail King. She received her PhD in Chinese literature at the University of Chicago in 1982, and from October 1982 until retirement in May 2019, she served as the Asian Studies librarian in the Harold B. Lee Library of Brigham Young University in Bravo, Utah. My response to Dr. Gail King's book is actually threefolded. Her title is A Model for All Christian Women, Candida Xu, a Chinese Christian woman of the 17th century, published by Routledge, 2021. First, I would like to locate King's book and compare it with other academic works on related topics. In recent writings about Christian women in pre-modern East Asia, books such as Haruku Nawata Wars, Women Religious Leaders in Japan's Christian History, 1549 to 1650, published in 2009, and Nadine Amsler's Jesuits and Matriarchs, Domestic Worship in Early Modern China, published in 2018, have made significant contributions in pioneering historical studies of the understudied women in Catholicism. Gail King's book builds on the efforts of highlighting women's Christian experience in 17th century China and focuses on Candida Xu, 1607 to 1680, one of the most remarkable historical figures in Chinese Christianity. Instead of examining a collective Christian community in the 17th century, the micro-historical approach allows us to understand the details of Candida's context and the macro-level history of the late Ming and early Qing dynasties. Engaging Philippe Couplet's first French biography of Candida, Histoire d'une dame Christine de la Chine, the story of a Christian lady of China, published in 1688, and the Xu family history, and navigating the general lack of women's lives in official histories, King creatively addresses her topic from the interdisciplinary perspective of both history and literature. Her work successfully fills the lacuna and brings Candida's life alive to 21st century English readers. The second part of my response is going to, I'll make some direct comments on the content of the book. Gail, you have meticulously described and explained the cultural, socio-political, and economic context and background surrounding the roots, life, and faithful works of Candida Xu in such a way that as if she has stepped off your book and traveled through time. Your scholarly skills have enabled you to be the perfect detective historian who has pieced together complex and rich primary and secondary sources. Instead of a hagiography, your biography of Candida presented an authentic individual Christian who was deeply connected with her family, friends, and involved with her community and beyond. You have reflected both her inner qualities, outward circumstances, her actions, and how others have perceived her. We can then witness Candida Xu's suffering and joy. Your writing has carefully attended to your English reading audience and addressed some of the questions which could be answered, speculated, or left unanswered because of the source we have. Your book has also allowed us to see Candida Xu as a faithful Chinese Christian whose patronage of the Jesuit mission and whose service to the marginalized contributed to both church and society. More importantly, Candida's legacy serves as a powerful witness to her Christian faith. She is indeed, as your title has suggested, a model for all Christians. Your work will also pave the way for future scholars to study and to write in the field. The awarding of this honor of your book as one of the 6 groundbreaking books in the study of Chinese religion is well deserved. The third part of my response is 5 different questions because your book is really stimulating. Question number 1 is, the acts of charity from Candida's paternal great-grandfather, Xu Sicheng, and his mother, Lady In, are striking because of the similar ethics in Christian charity toward the poor and the widows and orphans. You have also explained well how Chinese Christians attempted to abstain from concubinage. How did Chinese Christians interact with some cultural values such as filial piety, the preference of a boy child, and also the classical training for upper class girls? Question number 2, as Christians living in a cultural framework of Neo-Confucian philosophy and values, Candida Xu revealed her theology of religion when she handed her adult son's books from Taoism and Buddhism to her confessor for burning. Would you comment further on Candida's understanding of other minority religions in 17th century China? Question number 3, on page 45, we have indications that Candida wrote letters to other Chinese Christian women and missionaries. Do we know what happened to these letters? Number 4, Candida navigated the space of gender and social location in the 17th century, having had 2 Jesuit spiritual directors, Francesco Brancati and Philip Coupley, for years. Candida did cross a few significant boundaries and expectations. You have complexed the issue by stating Christian women's agency of using the gender separation in service of their Christian faith. Would you add some more analysis of why Candida's boundary crossing did not clash with the Neo-Confucian system of controlling women's behaviors? So my final question is, in Coupley's original biography of Candida, he called her an apostle of China. Here I'm using Julie Sullivan's 2019 translation of Coupley's biography. Is there a specific reason why you chose a model for all Christian women over Apostles of China, or Apostle of China as your book title? Thank you so much for listening, and once again, congratulations.
Thank you. Wonderful.
Checking the time. Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I'm not very familiar at all with Zoom. So I will just answer your questions one by one. The first one is about Chinese Christians interacting with cultural values. As far as filial piety goes, the missionaries linked that with the 4th of the 10th commandment, which is honor thy father and thy mother so that your days will be long on the earth. So that
observing the fourth commandment and filial piety were sort of the same thing. Chinese Christians observed the Chinese practices of honoring their parents and grandparents while they were alive. The Jesuits allowed bowing to ancestor tablets. Other missionaries, specifically the Dominicans, did not. Okay. As far as preference for a boy, in a later document that was written in the 1660s, the missionaries suggested that if Christian families didn't want a boy, maybe they could give the girl to somebody else. And then, maybe they had more children. Certainly abortion was forbidden, and Chinese Christians were very active in rescuing children that had been discarded alongside the road. As far as classical training for upper class girls, I wasn't really sure what kind of training you meant. Education and keeping a house, those wouldn't have been any problem. If you mean bound feet, missionaries didn't think that was something they needed to worry about. They didn't oppose feet binding for Chinese women. And concubinage itself was not opposed. Concubines could become Christians. Christian men could not have concubines, but as far as the practice itself, your missionaries didn't approve, but they weren't in the business of social reform. Question 2, Canada's understanding of other minority religions. The other main organized religion, besides Taoism and Buddhism, in 17th century China would have been probably Islam. Manichaeism had existed in China from the Tang Dynasty when it entered China, but it had pretty much totally disappeared by the Ming Dynasty. There was a mosque in Shanghai, which still exists in Songjiang, Islamic mosque, built during the Yuan Dynasty, but nothing in any of the sources related to Candida Xu mentions that mosque. If she knew about it, I don't know, and what she thought of it, I don't know that either. What happened to the letters that Candida Xu wrote to missionaries and other Christian women? Well, one of them that I know of was translated and included in an annual mission report that was dated September 20th, 1639. A letter to another missionary, her confessor at the time, Father Brancati, was translated and included in Father Couplet's book. The letters to the Chinese Christian women, as far as I know, none of those have survived. None of them are known to have survived. Question 4 was, why did her boundary crossing not clash with the Neo-Confucian system of controlling women's behavior? Candida Xu was a part of the Confucian world. She lived in it, she accepted its values, and she followed its norms. Her primary loyalty was her Christian faith, but she lived that faith in a Confucian society and in the context of the social values of that society, like separation of women and hierarchical society. Furthermore, and this was really important in her life, she was of high social status and she came from a prominent family. She really didn't try to overturn Chinese social structure. She just used what she could to achieve her goals. For example, when her interactions with her confessors were all either by letters or under the eyes at a distance of men in her family. Secondly, she engaged in trade and commerce, but she didn't try to participate in the men's world of trade and commerce. That was handled by a servant. Women always did things by themselves, not with men. They embroidered, they wove, they prayed, they went to church meetings. And she used the authority that she had as a mother and also as the granddaughter of a very famous high-placed Chinese Christian. Her grandfather was Xu Guangqi, to achieve her goals also. That's not to say there weren't any difficulties for her. Her husband was a Buddhist and he opposed and occasionally threw little roadblocks into her practice of Christianity. The missionaries suggest that her husband had a concubine. He was not a Christian. She worked and worked to convert him, but did not outwardly, correct him or that kind of thing, because that wasn't her place. It was through her patient, gentle living with him through all of his outbursts. He seemed to have had he was sort of quick-tempered and would fly off. And then she helped him live through the pain of tuberculosis. She was very good at herbal concoctions. So, and why did I title it A Model for All Christian Women? I really did consider Apostle of China, but in the end, I chose A Model for All Christian Women, which is also one of the titles that Father Coupley gives her, because I think it more broadly encompasses the kinds of achievements that Candida Xu made. He presents, Father Coupley presents Candida Xu and her virtues in his book. He's trying to interest wealthy European women to be patrons of the China mission and to persuade them it'd be really great if you were like her too and sent us money. And from the late 19th century on, Chinese and Jesuit missionaries held Candida Xu up to Chinese Catholics as an example of a virtuous, generous, faithful Chinese Christian woman. And
we really need to move on to the next.
Sorry.
And I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Maybe you can reply directly to Suzanne to finish off your response. Thank you, though, and wonderful response from both of you. So we're going to move on to Eric Hammerstrom, who is commenting on Jens Reinke, Mapping Modern Mahayana, Chinese Buddhism, and Migration in the Age of Global Modernity.
Thank you. So a brief educational biography of Dr. Reinke. He earned his BA at Taiwan Normal University, his MA at Zhengzhi University in Taiwan, and recently his doctorate at Leipzig University in sinology. And in this past year, he began as an assistant professor at the University of the West in the United States, in California, where he also serves as the director of the Institute for the Study of Humanistic Buddhism, which is, it's interesting to see you are now working very close to one of your field sites. Wonderful. So by the end of the 20th century, several major Buddhist institutions had emerged in Taiwan. Displaying various forms of modern organization, these institutions continue to have a major impact on Chinese Buddhism around the globe. The most comprehensive of these organizations, and the one with arguably the greatest global success, is Foguangshan, or Buddha's Light Mountain. In this first book from Dr. Reinke, we learn about the public face of this organization and the way that it interacts with local cultures across the world. Methodologically, this is a qualitative social scientific work. Although some historical background is given on the notion of humanistic Buddhism, 人间佛教, and the role of humanistic Buddhism in fueling the socially engaged activities of Foguangshan, this book does not analyze the religious teachings of Foguangshan to a great extent, nor does it discuss the training or practice regimes of the monastic order that is the organization's core. Instead, As Reinke tells us, quote, "The aim of this book is to explore the conditions and dynamics that have facilitated the order's global development and the way they continue to shape its trajectory to this day. In other words, it is an attempt to map the globalization of the modern Chinese Mahayana," end quote. In order to construct his map, he focuses on 3 Foguangshan complexes: Xilai Temple in Los Angeles in the US state of California, Nanhua Temple in Bronkhorstspruit in South Africa, and Foguang Ancestral Dajue Temple in Jiangsu, China. Although Foguangshan has temples and offices throughout the world, these 3 sites were chosen to allow Reinke to assess the full range of the organization's activities in the West, in the Global South, and the context of Chinese cross-straits relations. Following an expected contextualization of Foguangshan within the 20th century history of Chinese Buddhism, Reinke provides specific context and information on the activities at each of these 3 sites. The book is not organized by site. Instead, it's organized around several major themes, including the importance of educational institutions within the organization, the role of charitable and civic-minded activity in creating community and a communitarian identity, and the intentional promotion of Chinese culture abroad. Reinke cites details of the activities at each of these 3 sites as he draws conclusions in each of these kind of areas or themes of study. So in one sense, this is an ethnography of an organization. It's concerned with questions that operate at a larger scale than the individual. Although not thickly descriptive, the author does recount their observations of at least one major public event at each of these 3 sites. Although there are some details on religious practice, the author is more concerned with larger issues of demographics and culture writ large, right? Culture in a broad sense. So to some extent, this work follows the other major Anglophone monograph on Foguangshan, which is Stuart Chandler's 2004 book, Establishing a Pure Land on Earth. Both of these books focus on Foguangshan as a new type of Chinese Buddhist organization, on its use of humanistic Buddhism, on its focus on education, on its international efforts at growth, and the role of the Buddha's Light International Association, the BLIA, within Foguangshan activities. However, Reinke's book, in addition to offering details about recent growth, provides a much clearer analysis of Foguangshan's overseas activities within the context of globalization. And that's a key, this book was published in a series on globalization. So it's a key issue for the author as well as the series. And it does not disappoint in that goal. The focus on globalization, which Reinke describes as, quote, a dynamic meta order that is generated through the border crossing activities of multiple actors at a myriad of locations, end quote. This focus makes the book an apt entry into its series. Throughout the book, Reinke remains sensitive to the processes by which Chinese Buddhism and Chinese people have traveled to, interacted with, and become part of a range of localities throughout the world. He observes that in this context, Foguangshan international activities seem to be animated by 2 connected but distinct goals. 1, the spreading of Buddhism, and 2, the spreading of Chinese culture. Regarding this latter goal, Reinke frames his analysis of Foguangshan within the context of global Chinese culture. Adapting Yang Fengang's idea of the global East, Reinke uses the concept of global China, which he describes thusly. Quote, global China is not ethnicity alone, nor a connection to the localities inhabited by ethnic Chinese, but rather the prevalence of Chinese language, particularly but not exclusively Mandarin, and certain cultural practices and discourses within the context of this order, end quote. Given that Foguangshan is operating in the context of global China, it is perhaps not surprising that a great emphasis is placed in the organizing and promoting of Chinese culture, and to a lesser extent, Chinese language within Foguangshan activities. One result of this has been that despite the fact that Foguangshan is internationally and intentionally global, its global presence remains primarily, perhaps exclusively, rooted in overseas Chinese communities. Reinke intentionally points us to the diversity within these communities and observes that participation and membership in Foguangshan's global sites has changed in years, mirroring trends in migration within and throughout the Chinese diaspora. Foguangshan international sites were mostly supported by immigrants from Taiwan through the latter part of the 20th century, but this has changed dramatically as immigration from the PRC has increased in the last 2 decades. There have also been shifts in patterns of migration from Southeast Asia of Chinese speaking and Chinese communities. Personally speaking, it is these latter observations that I find most intriguing about this book and where I see its greatest contribution to the scholarship on modern Chinese Buddhism. As I noted before, this is not really a book of religious studies, but it's a social scientific book. I read it with great personal interest for myself due to budgetary issues and reorganization of my university. I myself will be leaving a department of religion where I've been for 12 years and joining an area studies department within a few months. So this question about globalization was really on my mind. And I think it should be on everyone's mind. Chinese religion, and even something that I've now learned to call global China, is something that I will definitely be thinking a lot about after reading this book. I expect that global China is going to be a concept I'm going to be teaching with my students to think with. He's given us a well-written book with clear theoretical insights about precisely these questions, and so it is welcome for that. I close with a few questions about where the author might want to take this research. The first question I have is regards to access. So if you were to get access to the inner workings, which given that you now work at University of the West, my guess is this is happening. If you were to gain access to the inner workings and interviews with people in leadership positions of the organizations, is that something you'd be interested in pursuing? And what kind of questions would you want to ask them to further flesh out this type of work, right? So abbots and those types of figures. Secondly, you've provided some useful thoughts about the potential future of Foguangshan as an organization, especially as it looks to second and third generation Chinese migrants. But I'm curious, do you think that it's likely or even possible that a similar parallel organization could emerge within global Chinese Buddhism? For example, could you see a similar organization originating from mainland being able to spread to the same extent that Foguangshan has now been able to expand to? And finally, my third kind of question or cluster of questions is a general one. If it isn't one of these two things, right? If it isn't a question about the inner workings of the organization or about the context of kind of modern Chinese Buddhism globally, what is your next project? Do you intend to remain in the qualitative social scientific vein, or will you branch out to more quantitative ventures or more religious studies oriented ones, or do you have something else cooking? So thank you very much. I want to thank you for this book, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. First, I want to thank to the Society for the Study of Chinese Religions, of course, for selecting my book. I feel very grateful and truly honored. And of course, lots of thanks to you, Eric, for your very thoughtful response and your questions. So let me just jump right into answering your questions. The first one, access. Actually, I did have access to many higher levels of the organization, and someone who's familiar with Foguangshan knows probably that you can't just pop up at the temple and trying to do research there. It has to be like long prepared. The reasons why I didn't use the data is I feel that the main engine of Foguangshan's global spread are the religious needs of what I call like is globally minded ethnic Chinese middle class and the internally complex dynamics of post-1965 ethnic Chinese migration. Those shape the transnational trajectory of Foguangshan much more than the many campaigns they had and the several other initiatives they've started over the last 4 decades. So on the contrary, what I would be much more interested in and where I didn't get access to is not the Foguangshan monastic and abbots, but the everyday member, the everyday temple visitors who are not BLIA members, right? So who come to the temple, who pray or who are involved in any of these, well, mainly religious activities, but who are not associated to the BLIA, and thus for me, they're much harder to reach, right? Because their interactions are much more fleeting. And of course, I couldn't, there's some protocol to follow at Foguangshan. So that's the part I feel like I would have loved to work on more for the book. Of course, also you need more manpower because I had 3 globally dispersed field sites, and there were a lot of visitors at the Foguangshan temple every day. Second to the, if there is like if there could be a similar organization originating from the mainland, and it's also a great question, thanks. Of course, there's many groups who kind of try to, I don't want to say copy, who try to learn from Foguangshan's globalization project. And there are many groups, smaller groups in Taiwan, but also ethnic Chinese Buddhist temples in Southeast Asia, and of course also the People's Republic of China. And I guess the most prominent example is Lungchen Temple, which has already developed a global presence that somewhat mirrors Foguangshan's global temple network. However, of course, we know the political situation in the PRC is very specific, and the role of religion in general and Buddhism in particular is also very specific. So on the one hand, it's highly regulated, and on the other, it's somewhat, I don't know, incorporated into CCP diplomacy framework. So that kind of limits these possibilities, and especially if you consider more recent developments like the Xuecheng incident, 2 years in 2018, I think. And of course, the rising tensions between the US and the PRC. So the short answer is, I don't know what the future will bring. But of course there could be some. But right now I see that those attempts were made in the PRC, like Lungchen Temple, they were more successful 3 or 4 years ago than right now. But on a smaller level, there's many attempts, so very alive. And the third question, about my future plans. Okay, actually, I'm already working on my second book project for 2 years now. Of course, like a little, the pandemic didn't really helped in these regards. And the second book continues to look at Taiwanese Buddhist transnationalism, but instead of looking at one particular organization, I'm shifting my focus on a geographic space. So I'm looking at Buddhist linkages between Taiwan and Southeast Asia. And they have 3 different main case studies I'm looking at here. And in fact, tomorrow noon, I will present at one of the 3 at a panel here at the AAS. In terms of methodology, I don't really think a qualitative social science approach is really like in contradiction with religious studies perspective, but I think I understand what you're hinting at. And in the case of my Foguangshan book, Foguangshan is of course not famous for their like specifically like very original engagement with Buddhology. But I would argue much more in the way they are able to popularize modern Chinese Mahayana in a way to that speaks to these internally highly diverse, globally minded ethnic Chinese middle class. And that's why I focused on this part for my first book. For my second book, I will apply Adam Chow's 5 modalities of doing religion. And the first one, of course, also includes like textual, scriptural modality. So there will be more about, certain like Buddhist thoughts within these groups, at least in case of one of the 3 case studies, one that is more intellectually minded. Yeah, those are my answers to your questions. I hope I answered them, and thank you very much. And thank you so much for the whole activity, for the whole event, and also to all the other authors and speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, our next respondent is Eric Green, who will be responding to Jeffrey Goebel's Chinese Esoteric Buddhism, Amoghavajra, Ruling Elite, and Emergence of a Tradition. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Gil. I don't have a long introduction for Professor Goebel, so I'm just going to launch right in to the book. Yeah. Chinese Esoteric Buddhism is a historical analysis of the formation of a religious tradition, in particular, the tradition that Goebel calls Chinese Esoteric Buddhism. It intervenes in a long-running debate among Western scholars concerning the nature of this tradition. In the standard story that was told for much of the 20th century, Chinese Esoteric Buddhism was a distinct school of Chinese Buddhism that can be traced to the 3 Indian Buddhist teachers active in the 8th century in China, Shubhakara Simha, Vajrabodhi, and Amoghavajra. These men introduced to China, the story goes, a new form of Buddhism, form of the so-called Tantric Buddhism that was emerging in India around this time. In the past several decades, however, a number of revisionist Western historians have argued that this picture is essentially a sectarian myth of the Japanese Shingon school, back projected onto China. The so-called founders of Chinese esoteric Buddhism, it's argued, were not seen and did not see themselves as proffering a new form of Buddhism at all. And indeed, those things that are often thought to be distinctive to Chinese esoteric Buddhism, such as the use of mantras and dharanis, had in fact been part of Chinese Buddhism for centuries. So Goebel has approached this debate by, simply put, doing the history. And he can do this in part because we have, for some of the key 8th century personages, an exceptionally large number of firsthand documents chronicling their interactions with their elite patrons over the course of several successive Chinese emperors. This corpus of documents, comprised of letters, imperial edicts, memorials, and so forth, does have some limitations, most importantly that it was largely transmitted within the Buddhist fold, and therefore may be, to some degree, a selective record. But even with this caveat, I think that Goebel is correct in his claim that this corpus allows us the closest glimpse that we have, really anywhere in the Buddhist world up until about the year 1000, of the interactions between Buddhist and political power. These documents have, of course, been known to scholars in China and Japan and the West, but Western scholarship has not until now mined them thoroughly. And from this point of view alone, Goebel's book is really a singular contribution to understanding this history. Using these sources and many others, Goebel aims to give us as complete a picture as possible of how the teachings and practices of the early patriarchs of Chinese esoteric Buddhism were presented and understood in their own time. His argument works in two directions. On the one hand, he wants to argue that it is wrong to give up the idea of a distinct school of Chinese esoteric Buddhism. It was in fact claimed here that there was a new form of Buddhism, one centered around a novel mythology of Buddhist enlightenment and a scriptural corpus distinct from the traditional canon. Moreover, this new form of Buddhism was institutionalized to some degree. Access to it was mediated by a new form of ritualized initiation, the famous tantric rituals of consecration, abhisheka or guande, conducted by a select group of monks who had gained control of key imperial temples. At the same time, Goebel by no means merely defends the traditional Shingon-influenced perspective. Rather, he argues that even though there was an identifiable esoteric Buddhism, capital E, this wasn't merely a pre-existing thing that was transmitted to China by Shubhakara Simha Vajrabodhi and Amoghavajra. Rather, it was something that emerged only with Amoghavajra, Bukong, the last of these three patriarchs in time. As Goebel shows through careful maintenance of networks of patronage across several generations, Amoghavajra became arguably the most highly honored Buddhist monk in Chinese imperial history. That he was able to do this is explained by the specific historical context of the Anlushan rebellion and its immediate aftermath, which allowed Amoghavajra to gain the support of three successive emperors, Xuanzong, Suzong, and Daizong. And he did this by aligning his new teachings and ritual methods with something that Goebel calls imperial Buddhism. That is to say, the long-standing system in which Buddhist rituals were sponsored, the protection of the emperor, and the benefit of the state. Something that Goebel situates within an even larger frame that he calls imperial religion. Within this frame, Goebel makes a very novel and interesting argument that Amoghavajra's new tantric ritual technologies attracted the support they did because they promised something special, the ability to actually kill your enemies, which was a power that no previous form of Buddhism or any other Chinese ritual tradition that was sponsored by the empire had explicitly offered before. And this, Goebel suggests, proved irresistibly attractive to the imperial court during and in the immediate aftermath of the Anlushan rebellion. So this is a quite brief summary of Goebel's very rich book, which does not do all of it justice by any means. And I'll just say in general that I think that for a long time, this is really going to remain the definitive study of the history of early Chinese esoteric, the beginnings of Chinese esoteric Buddhism. So it's really a wonderful contribution for that. I do, of course, have some questions about some of the things that Goebel does with this rich material, which I'll sort of say about now. First, this book is, among other things, addressing a question that many historians of Chinese religion have been curious about. Question we might call the formation of religious traditions as the result of patronage, specifically imperial patronage. And I think of Goebel's book as a kind of exemplary case study of this phenomenon in this one case. But this did make me wonder about how this relates to the broader phenomenon, how the case of Chinese esoteric Buddhism was the same or different from the many other times in history when Chinese religious traditions formed under these conditions of patronage. The focus of Goebel's book lies on Chinese esoteric Buddhism, and he doesn't really, as far as I can see, get into that question, but it's something that I wondered about as I was reading and after I had finished. So maybe Jeffrey will be able to speak to that in a moment. This does lead me to a second question I had. And throughout the book, Goebel argues that the object he identifies was indeed a new form of Buddhism, Chinese esoteric Buddhism with a capital E. I found Goebel to be convincing in his argument that Amoghavajra and his followers had much more of a sense of their own distinction than some revisionist historians have allowed. But as I understand him, Goebel also wants to claim that this distinction merits being thought of as a new form of Buddhism, capital E, esoteric Buddhism. He even goes so far as to sometimes refer to certain historical actors as esoteric Buddhists, again, capital E. Now, on the one hand, of course, I think there's an understandable desire here to find language to distinguish this tradition that Goebel has identified from the broader, what's sometimes called lowercase e, esoteric Buddhism, in the sense of rituals using dharani and mantra and things like that, which, as I said, had always been part of Chinese Buddhism. But at the same time, I do worry that this language of sort of capital E, esoteric Buddhism, might lead one to impute a kind of exclusivity to this tradition, to Amoghavajra and his disciples. Now, one interesting and very important part of Goebel's book is to show that Amoghavajra and his disciples did have names for what they were doing, and that distinguished them from others. And that they had these names, this is very important, I would agree, and it's a clear sign of some kind of identity that was being built around this time and by these groups of people. But on the other hand, I also noticed that these names changed, or at least they weren't always the same. And they were not, as far as I could tell from the material presented by Goebel in his book, used to modify, say, Buddhism as a whole. So even though Amoghavajra and his followers do seem to have had certain ritual traditions that were theirs and theirs alone, as Goebel acknowledges in several parts of his book, these were not the only things that they did. Goebel tries to separate this out by arguing that Amoghavajra had a kind of dual identity. On the one hand, an esoteric Buddhist, and on the other hand, what he calls an imperial Buddhist. This move I do wonder about, and whether this begs the question to some degree. I hope that in asking this, I'm not sounding entirely pedantic. My concern here is that talk of capital E, esoteric Buddhism and esoteric Buddhists might end up reinscribing onto the history of Chinese Buddhism the notion of distinct sects or institutions, something that in contrast to Japan was rarely the case, as many scholars have tried to show over the past decades. Indeed, the scholars that Goebel takes issue with, those who argued that we should not imagine there ever to have been a distinct school of Chinese esoteric Buddhism, those scholars often made their arguments as part of a broader effort to show that medieval Chinese Buddhism was rarely sectarian in the way that Japanese Buddhism is. That unlike their Japanese descendants, the schools of Chinese Buddhism like Chan or Huayan or Tiantai were not discrete institutions. In terms of the monasteries they inhabited, the social and religious criteria they fulfilled to be counted as monks or nuns, and the broad doctrinal understandings they shared, Buddhist monks and nuns were all essentially part of a single institution. So my question then would be whether talk of capital E esoteric Buddhism or capital E esoteric Buddhist, does this commit us to something too exclusive? How can we best acknowledge the historical reality of the kind of identity formation that I think that Goebel really does manage to excavate and show us the contours of with this book, but while also avoiding the problems of the kind of sectarian reading of the history of Chinese Buddhism that we've often had in the past. I should say, I, of course, don't have an answer to this question. So this is just something that this book makes me wonder about how to do this, how to balance these two sides of things. So those are my sort of summary, and then some questions that hopefully we'll have some time to answer. But this really was a fantastic book about a topic that sort of has long been lingering, I think, in the scholarship on history of Chinese Buddhism, for waiting for someone to really actually dive into these sources, which, as I said, are really quite unique in terms of this corpus of letters between the emperor and Amoghavajra, which really we have nothing like this either before or for a long time afterwards. So to have a thorough study of this material now in English is a great contribution. So I really appreciated the chance to get to read this book for this panel. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Let me start off by saying thank you to the board and officers of the SSCR for choosing my book for this really rich and informative panel. And also thank you, Eric, for the time and attention and the insightful comment and the kind words you had for the work. Your comments or questions are insightful. They're good questions, by which I mean I don't have an easy answer for them. So I'll say a few words, I guess, in response, some initial thoughts about them. Yeah, I think your observation about the formation of sectarian Buddhism in response to patronage that the book kind of points to, I think it's a good one. It's certainly not work that I did in the book. Hopefully, my book will provide good material for someone who will engage with that very question, that very intriguing question that you bring to our attention. I'd like to say regarding the observation that regarding the terminology that you pointed out, that although I consistently refer to this iteration of Buddhism as esoteric with a capital E, you're quite right in observing that the historical actors themselves will often invoke a number of different terms to refer to this iteration of Buddhism, various parameters. It is a good observation. That's one that I'm aware of as well, and something that I worked with and tried to work through and around with the book. In choosing to refer to this as esoteric Buddhism with a capital E rather than by an indigenous term, the teaching of the five divisions, or something like Janyan, as Charlie Orzek is sometimes referred to it as, I wanted to kind of lay out a case for pushing back against the negative scholarships, suggesting that there was no indigenous recognition of anything that would map to a contemporary conception of esoteric Buddhism. So I wanted to keep that term, while nevertheless recognizing that there were a number of different options or different terminologies that were employed by the historical actors in question. I think this fact is important to bring out as I thought about this historical information and thought about this tradition. I had in the back of my mind, one of the guiding questions or one of the guiding critiques that I had in my mind as I wrote this work was the challenge, the question, is there esoteric Buddhism? Scholars sometimes are often answering in the negative. And it strikes me as a very odd question. What does it mean for an object of conception to exist historically? Certainly the terminology that historical actors use give us indication that there is something of a conception of this sort of Buddhism as distinct from other forms. But I think that it would be historically inaccurate and reckless to think that there was any single conception, certainly any single conception that would track to a contemporary model of a sectarian esoteric Buddhism. The esoteric Buddhism, what I'm thinking of as I'm referring to as esoteric Buddhism in this Tang Dynasty, is necessarily multiple. It, I believe, refers to or captures a referent that existed in the minds of multiple historical actors, such that naturally the terms are going to vary. What the terms that Amoghavajra uses are going to be different than the terms that various emperors are going to use, that Amoghavajra's disciples and successors use. But rather than get into a semantic argument, I wanted to employ esoteric Buddhism as a tool for tracking these shifting analyses, these shifting historical conceptions, with the recognition that there can be no single historical conception that we could identify, or that we would, I think, legitimately foist onto the historical actors. I think that your critique or your comment regarding the reification of the sect is well taken. It is, I think, as you point out, something of a balancing act to try to, on the one hand, construct a historical concept that will allow us to capture the data, the very rich data that we have available to us, without hypothesizing along the lines of contemporary Japanese sectarian formations, for example. It is a balancing act. I don't claim to have to pull it off successfully at all times. I will just say, I'm cognizant of the time, but I do want to say that one of the interesting things about this, as I thought about it, is that one of the perhaps justifications that I have in my mind for thinking about this as a sectarian formation or a discrete iteration of Buddhism is that we see in the mythology of the tradition put forward by Amoghavajra, we see a reformation or refiguration of the basic Shakyamuni mythology, in which the mythology of the awakening and the Bodhi tree is reformulated in such a way that the enlightenment of Shakyamuni is cast as an intervention by deities, and that subject into initiation, mandalic visualizations, the various practices that are normative for this tradition, such that I think that I might there's a danger of pushing this a little bit too far. But one of the things that I see as being really interesting and significant about this is that you do see the founder of the larger Buddhist tradition, Shakyamuni, being refigured, reformulated in such a way as to argue for this as a discrete, identifiable mode of Buddhism. So yes, I don't think that we are justified in understanding this as a discrete sectarian tradition on the model of Japanese norms. But I do think that it's worth entertaining at least the idea that we do see a particular iteration of Buddhism, a certain new direction, at least within the larger tradition, as emblematic or exemplified by, I think, this refigured mythology. So thank you again, Eric, and thank you all for your time and attention.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to Chloe Starr responding to Yang Hongfan's Ite Missa Est, ritual interactions around Mass in China.
Thank you very much. And since we have two people left and we're running a little behind time at this point, I'm going to cut down my remarks. And if anybody wishes to read the big document, I have it in front of me, I can email a copy to you. So Yang Hongfan completed her PhD in 2019 from Peking University, the Philosophy and Religious Studies department, and she spent the 2 years after that, sadly during the pandemic, at Leuven doing a postdoctoral, and she's back in Changsha at the moment, so I hate to think what time of the day it is for you. Thank you for being with us. So this splendid book focuses on the role of the Mass in Roman Catholic life and thought in Mingqing China, a topic that, as Yang says, hasn't really been studied in any depth before. And her study considers four major themes to do with the Mass: the object of worship, that's basically God and Jesus, the intention of what's going on in Masses, the people who perform the worship, and the place or ritual space and time. And in terms of methodology, she wants a mode that's neither sinocentric nor Eurocentric, but situating the in-betweenness as a site of study. So the Christianization of Chinese society and the Sinicization of Catholic rituals. She takes a definition of ritual as activities that construct meaning and value, and looks at how they shape ordinary life. She draws on Nicholas Stendhal's work on Chinese funeral rituals and other ritual study work, but primarily it's a theological text, I think, in many ways. So my first question is, can we actually get to rituals through the materials? There is a fundamental problem, obviously, in studying ritual without any of our visual, our gustatory, our olfactory, our haptic senses being engaged, and very few records of how they were at the pack, which changes the nature of a study of ritual. This is sort of historical archaeology or archaeological anthropology in a sense. The book offers both prescriptive and descriptive texts, but it is quite text heavy, and the data means that there's fewer of those personal stories and responses. So we don't get much of a sort of how I felt during the Mass or what the Mass meant to me feel, but we do understand a lot more of what Chinese Christians in the Ming and Qing knew about the Mass and understood about the Mass through this study. First chapter looks at the object of worship then. And the question that the missionaries were asked, is it blasphemy if only the Son of Heaven can offer sacrifice to heaven? How come you Christians are offering sacrifice to the Lord of heaven each week? And so there's a lot of debate about, what this means. And obviously Confucian literati weren't very happy, but actually Shunzhi and Kangxi were perfectly okay about it all, which is sort of interesting. So what kind of mass is what kind of sacrifice is the mass? And this egalitarian nature of Christian practice is really a social problem right at the outset. Is God Tian? Kangxi thought so, interestingly. And it's actually quite astonishing reading these debates. And I didn't know this level of detail, so I was very excited to read all about this. Kangxi has remarkable latitude long before Vatican II. He comes off as more Catholic than the Pope, a better Catholic, you could argue. He pens all these plaques with Jing Tian written on, venerate heaven, worship heaven, and argues that honoring heaven is honoring the Lord of heaven, i.e. the Christian God. So as one missionary wrote, that means, hang on a sec, haven't Chinese then been like an Abrahamic religion, honoring God for the last 2,000 years, since at least the Zhou? I wonder what it would mean for the Catholic Church to think a bit more like that. Or what does it mean for Guoshe, if that's true? So Confucian monotheism, which actually be akin to Abrahamic religions. So chapter 2 argues that the Mass could promote the salvation of the souls of the deceased, and this helped to spread the Mass in China. And Yang sets out how Catholic thinking on the cure of the souls, the care of the souls of the dead, is very much like Buddhist thinking. And you can see all these parallels here. The Chinese corpse becomes an ancestor, the Christian corpse becomes a saint. So you're spreading out the kinship into the wider world in Christian. And we can get a sense of all these problems. How does this relate to ancestor sacrifices if the Christian one is like Chinese rituals? And the question at the center of this rights controversy, can you sacrifice to ancestors, which we all know about, isn't a question about terminology, whether it's venerate or sacrifice, but a question about the nature of Christian sacrifice and how it's understood. And of course, the Jesuits were split on this matter. But one question I have about the chapter, and I still don't really understand, is how did the missionaries or the Chinese Christians square their criticisms of Buddhist practices with their own Christian practice? Because if masses can atone for the dead in some way, and you can fast and give alms, and that helps the dead in purgatory, how is that different to their criticisms of what the Buddhists are doing? So the third area is looking at indigenous clergy and liturgy. And Yang suggests that the Chinese clergy took on these new roles as Western Confucianists, as religious professionals, like the Taoists and the Buddhists. And as she says, the European role of priest and scholar didn't really work in China. You had to be either or. So a question I have here is this very protracted nature of the path to Chinese priesthood. It seems that everyone wanted indigenous Chinese priests long ago. And part of the story that Yang brings out really well is that the Pope, an early Pope in the 1610s, did allow a really high degree of indigenization. They could have Mass in Chinese, they could celebrate it with their heads covered, and you could translate the Bible into Wenyan. And yet this was lost and not permitted later. By the 1660s, everyone was back to Latin, and you had to go back to much more Roman forms. So one thing I want to ask is, you say it was, a really urgent measure to have priests, and you say that indigenous clergy and indigenous liturgy were linked, but I'm not wholly sure about that. That seems to me, a question. And one thing before I go, I just do want to share with you for 1 second this picture, because I think it's such a splendid picture. So this is the hat that the Catholic priests wore, the special hat they wore to celebrate Mass, so that they would be honoring heaven and not doing it with their heads uncovered. And I just think that's such a great thing to have a picture of in your book. So I really enjoyed it. It's a great book. It bears close reading, brings lots of new texts and incidents to life, and really deepens our understanding of the reality, lived reality of the Catholic Church in Ming and Qing. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Yang Hongfan.
Okay. Good morning from Changsha to you all. I'm really glad to be here. I'm very grateful to the board of SSCR, and especially to Professor Gilratz and Elena Valusi for holding this event. It's such a great opportunity, especially for a young scholar as me. And Professor Starr, I truly appreciate your encouraging and insightful comments. yes, as you mentioned, the theological study, because this research on the Mass has a strong theological connotation. However, actually, I focus on the social dimension of the Mass, that is to explore Christianization in Chinese society and the syncretization of Catholic rituals. Because I was writing my dissertation for a PhD degree in religious studies, and it's at the Department of Philosophy. So I tended to avoid deep theological analysis. But as I noted in the conclusion of this book, a theological dimension smoothly pervades this book as the scent of incense sprays in the celebration of Mass. And also, as you mentioned about the texts, yeah, there are not many texts. Actually, it's very few. And that's the first and the biggest obstacle for me to do this research. That is to find enough primary sources, especially primary sources in Chinese. That's super challenging, but that's also what makes this research appealing to me. So there are only a few works in the Chinese Christian texts that are solely dedicated to Mass. And then you have Roman Missal, you have all those rules and regulations and all those explanations about the procedure of the Mass. And some readers, especially Chinese Catholic priests, when they hear my title, Ida Missa Est, and then they will say, oh, so it's about Roman Missal at that time, it's about the procedures. But that's not really what I'm focusing on, because all those texts, these are prescriptive texts. They're describing what the Mass should be at that time, ideally, what people should do, should act ideally, but not necessarily actually happened. And also for those descriptive texts written by Christians at that time, they're very concise about the Mass. Although it's such an essential ritual for them, they would only mention by one or two sentences, like date, we had Mass, ended. They would record homily from the Mass, but not a whole homily, only points and sentences that they find rewarding to themselves. So it's really difficult to find all those texts directly on the Mass. And it's a closed ritual behind locked doors for all those non-Christians in Chinese society. So it's really an activity restricted to a small group. But that doesn't mean that my exploration have to be restrained to this closed ritual. So I started to select a large number of scattered materials pertaining to Mass, maybe directly or maybe indirectly. So you would see I roughly categorized those primary sources as prescriptive and descriptive, and some of them may overlap. You'd see there are various kinds of sources, but yet in each kind, I can't guarantee there are many examples in every kind. But even with these few texts, I think those examples in this book are really powerful and really interesting. And there are two major questions at the center of the rights controversy. As it has been studied, that's the question of terminology and how to cope with traditional Chinese rituals. But in this book, I'd like to look at the other side of the Chinese rights controversy with those new findings of texts. That's a question about the nature of Christian sacrifice. How did the missionaries and Chinese Christians introduce and propagate Catholic rituals, especially the Mass in this book? So the text it's around its interaction around the Mass, not necessarily directly on the Mass. So you see the process of propagation, you see people's understanding, not necessarily from Christians, but also from non-Christians and all those anti-Catholics, especially Buddhists. And it's really interesting. And you get to see people's daily discussions, thoughts, and practices. Maybe not many, but powerful enough. And you get to see all those struggles between being a Catholic and being a Chinese at the same time. So it's really concise and intense materials that I used. And because time is limited, I can't respond to every questions. I'm really glad to be here to share this fresh research to the field. And thank you all again.
Oh, thank you so much. Great. So I'm going to introduce the last book in a minute. But before that, I just want to say, I think there's a lot of, there might be many questions for discussion between the various participants here, but I will have to jump off just after 4 o'clock. So I think Elena will provide us just in a chat room with her own Zoom. So as soon as the last book presentation is over, we can jump there, and I can then leave and go to my meeting. So I apologize in advance. So the last presentation is by Stephen Corey, as he's already posted his PowerPoint. So Stephen Corey will be discussing Dominique Stavau's The Root of the Three Sovereigns from Local Law to Institutional Taoism. Thank you to Steve.
Yeah, good evening, morning, afternoon, whatever, good everyone. Professor Dominique Stievu is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He received his PhD from Stanford, and as we all know, this is his first book. So I'll begin by simply thanking Elena and Gil for the opportunity to speak on Dominique's book. And I'll begin with just a few uncited comments from reviewers to kind of help put us in the mood. A few of the comments that you see on the screen here, hopefully you're reading them, were written by a few of the people who are with us today, but I won't point them out. So what largely ignored text and what important yet neglected aspect of Taoist history are traced and analyzed in Dominic Stievu's groundbreaking new book. The text is the San Huangwen, or the Writ of the Three Sovereigns. Traced and analyzed are not only the content and development of the text, along with the third of three major textual divisions of the Taoist canon, but also the directly related synthesis of different Taoist lines of transmission into an imperially endorsed and integrated institutional religion. So what I wanted to do originally is locate the significance of Dr. Stievu's work. But since we're running low on time, I'm not going to go through the whole first 1,000 years of Taoist history, but I'll simply mention that I was going to talk about, at least mention most of the names and terms that you see on the screen today. I'll kind of skip to the end of that summary to say that in 467, Lu Xiujing not only compiled a catalog of the Lingbao texts, but he also compiled the first integrated Taoist canon, which was divided into three caverns, or the Sandong, in descending order, as you see them on the screen. The Dongjian, the Cavern of Perfection, comprised of Sanqing or Shangqing, or upper clarity texts. Dongxuan, Cavern of Mystery, comprised of Lingbao, or numinous treasure texts. And Dongshan, Cavern of Divinity, comprised of Sanhuang, or Three Sovereigns text, featuring talismanic, alchemical, and summoning practices. While the Cavern of Divinity, or the Sanhuang corpus, has not been completely ignored, it's more than fair to claim that its development has been understudied and consequently underrepresented in Western language grand narratives on the first 1,000 years of Taoist history. This should end with the publication of Dominique Stievu's 2019 The Writ of the Three Sovereigns, From Local Lore to Institutional Taoism. Dominique's book carefully traces the evolution of the Writ of the Three Sovereigns from a set of powerful talismans used by early medieval Fang Shi, or masters of esoterica in the southern Jiangnan region, to a southern Taoist esoteric practice, and to a distinct scriptural and ritual corpus constituting one of three sections of the Taoist canon, at the heart of an integrated institutional Taoism by 574 during the Northern Zhou. The text history, however, does not end there. It's banned by the Tang court in the mid 7th century to make place for the Tao Te Ching at the start of the ritual transmission of materials constituting ordination into institutional Taoism. So far from being a side note in the early history of Taoism, the writ and the Dongshan canon are pivotal. Dominique's book includes an introduction, 5 chapters, a conclusion, and 4 appendices. Chapter 1 traces the history of the writ from its earliest 2 revelations, those of Bohe in the late 3rd century CE and Baojing years later. Both versions of the writ were transmitted in 4th and 5th century Jiangnan, but they eventually merged together into the text we now know today. Chapters 2 and 3 detail the religious and cosmological significance of talismans and charts, as well as the alchemical, meditative, and summoning practices transmitted and associated with the writ. Chapter 4 examines the writ's reception by other Taoist traditions, as well as its place in the first Taoist canon. And Chapter 5 traces the writ's development from the 6th century and beyond into, as Dominic puts it, quote, one of the scriptural anchors of integrated Taoism, unquote. Because it shared many of the same metaphors as imperial classicism, the writ became an inviting gateway into more refined Taoist teachings for classical scholars. The longest chapter in the book, Chapter 5, also details later developments in the San Huang corpus. Dominique's work expertly reconstructs the history of the San Huang Wen and clearly reveals its pivotal roles in the establishment of a canon, a liturgical program, and an ordination gauge for an institutional Taoism firmly recognized by the Imperium. Changes continue after the Tang, but by this time, there is already a congealed Taoist tradition integrating celestial masters, upper clarity, numinous treasure, and Southern San Huang texts and teachings. I highly recommend the book as a well-crafted and cogent untangling of a knotted mess that many have mentioned in passing, but few have stopped to carefully study. I found the detective-like introduction extremely inviting, and the detailed information on the writ's history and its talismanic, alchemical, meditative, and summoning practices both worth the price and worthy of addition to the old bookcase. I don't want to leave Dominique with nothing to respond to, so I'm just going to leave him with 3 very, very simple questions to save a little bit of time. The 3 questions will be, Dominic, was there anything that didn't make it into the book? What is the meaning of the cover from the Sansai Tu Hui? And what's next? So to everyone, 谢谢收听, and to Dominic himself, 佩服. Wonderful, wonderful work. I really enjoyed reading it. And I'll leave you with this image to maybe comment on, if you don't mind me leaving it up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Steve, for this this great response to the book. And I want to thank also the SSCR and more specifically Gil and Elena for putting this together and for also selecting my book. So many heartfelt thanks to you all. About the cover, yeah, we can start with that, I guess. And I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible. I don't have anything prepared, so I'll be going off the cuff. But this is a kind of nicer rendering or a more detailed rendering from a late imperial encyclopedia, but it reproduces some of the images that we have here in the book that are different incarnations of the 3 sovereigns, and they're all esoteric forms of the 3 sovereigns. I mean, these date from the Ming Dynasty canon, of course, so they're also relatively late. But in the text, one of the texts that I translate, you have the descriptions there. So I just thought it'd be cool to put them on there. And you do also have a Japanese emaki. Maybe I can share the screen now. If I can undercut you, Steve, here for a second. Here we go. That became available to me when I was looking through some stuff, and it has the same images or the same kind of iconography with the ox head and the kind of reptilian serpentine bodies and things like that. So this will permit me to kind of transition into the other question, stuff that was left out. Well, I would have liked to spend a bit more time analyzing this emaki, and I don't know what the date is. It's reproduced in the book in the epilogue, actually, where I talk a bit about the San Huangwen in Japan. And there's not much known about this, but yeah, I guess I've had a bit of time since then to look into it, but I haven't had the opportunity to do so. But that's one of the things that I would have liked to spend more time doing. It's just a very mysterious document that I can't find much information on, since it's a emaki, and these things are usually connected to like local traditions and stuff like that in Japan. So there's not always a written record. I would have also liked to spend, there's like a rich San Huang history in the Song Dynasty, where you have a kind of revivalism of these old Jiangnan traditions pertaining to, talismans, alchemy, mushrooms also, and entering like a true shape space and things like that, that make a comeback in the Song. And there's a bunch of San Huang scriptures that get produced at that time, but are presented as kind of original San Huang scriptures that were lost or not, or that have been recovered. So that didn't make it into the book, and that's one of the kind of directions that I'll be hopefully heading in the future. I've gotten interested in, since I'm going to your third question, what am I working on these days, in entheogens and the potential use of psychotropics in certain rituals or meditative practices in Taoism. So San Huang ties into that potentially. There's interesting mentions in a couple of texts, at least, of use of entheogens. So that's one project. I'm also working on Taoism and Buddhism in relation to Nestorian Christianity, just to connect with some of the stuff that, I mean, not directly, but indirectly with some of the stuff that we've been talking about today. And a separate project also that I'm trying to make headway on that involves receptions of Taoism outside of China. So I'm primarily for now working with Jesuit accounts of Taoism and the kind of misunderstandings and misrepresentations that you have, but it's kind of like a gold mine of stuff. And I'll be starting to potentially in association with people look at Tibetan and potentially like Kashmiri sources as well. What in the immediate future I'm working on is, and this should be submitted soon, a critical edition and annotated translation, bilingual translation, and study in the introduction, at least a hefty introduction, on the Wunengzi, which is a Tang Dynasty kind of treatise, Taoist treatise, that is, I guess you could classify it as political philosophy. So it's a bit of a departure from what I've been doing before. But what I find interesting is that you can, or I'm attempting at least to extract an environmental, Taoist environmental ethics from this text without getting, falling into the usual pitfalls of associating Taoism with nature and ecological thought and environmentalism. So something a bit more, I guess, critical, but and layered in terms of environmental ethic. But I think there's some interesting materials there that I'll be presenting soon in this monograph. So that's about it. I don't want to keep people here any longer than we've already been here, even though it's been very interesting. And so I thank you all again for attending, and thank you, Steve, as well for your analysis of my book, or review, or summary.
Great. Wow. Thanks so much. This was, this was, six really excellent presentation discussions. And I think there's a lot of conversation that can happen both between the authors and respondents and also some of our audience members. And we can start here, but as I said, I will have to jump off very soon. So maybe if those who want to stay on can go to Elena's room, which is actually in the chat right now, and I'll close